Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on unlocking government procurement opportunities in New Zealand. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Greg Harford. I'm the Chief Executive of the Canberra Business Chamber, and I'm really pleased to welcome with us today Charlotte Pottinger, who's the Manager of Business Relationships with MBIE, the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment from over in Wellington in New Zealand, and Craig Butler, who's the Head of Advisory and Business Services. Now, this webinar has been put together in partnership between the Canberra Business Chamber and our counterparts Business Central in Wellington. It is supported by the ACT Government's International Business Engagement Program. So thank you for joining us today. We're going to talk a little bit about the New Zealand government procurement landscape. We're going to talk about key regulations, key opportunities that are there for Australian businesses. We're going to explore high demand sectors, identifying those areas where there are significant procurement needs and where the growth potential is there for your businesses. We'll talk about practical tips for success. We've got some experts here to help us navigate the New Zealand government procurement market, and there'll be an opportunity for questions and answers at the end. So if you do have any questions, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen here, and we'll get to those at the end. So I'll hand over to Craig and Charlotte to take us through a presentation, and then we'll come back for Q&A.
Sure, thanks, Greg. Charlotte and I are going to take turns speaking to some of the slides we've got, and as Greg said, we'll start off with a bit of a general overview of the New Zealand government procurement system, and then we'll move into some more specifics on some opportunities and what's going on in the New Zealand market at the moment.
Hi everybody, I'm Charlotte Pottinger. As Greg said, I'm the manager for the business relationships team here at the New Zealand government procurement area of Ministry of Business and Innovation and Employment. So what we're talking about to begin with is just around procurement. We've got some slides here around what is procurement, how does it all work. We've got basically, we're looking at, you have a business need, and where we talk quite a lot about we need to buy something. Procurement has a lot of language around it that can be quite complex, but basically someone needs to purchase something. We need to make sure that there's always a plan for that procurement, understanding the market and having a strategic plan of what you're actually looking to purchase, the best way of approaching the market, and we'll talk a bit more about that further on. And then also we're actively working with suppliers to maximise that value across the sort of procurement life cycle. In New Zealand, the government spends around 51 billion to our latest numbers on goods and services with third-party suppliers. We've got a new government, as some of you may know, recently in October, and this government has a bit of a change of focus, which is generally around more in terms of fiscal sustainability. So there's been a bit of a change for government departments in general here in New Zealand that you may see in the news as well, which is changing some of the focus from particular areas and policies that the previous government had, and looking more towards where money is spent and making sure that we're delivering good public value from the money that is spent within government. The government puts expectations on agencies around their procurement activities. So we've got procurement rules and guidance, and our role as part of New Zealand government procurement is as the system lead, and we coordinate activities and run a whole lot of all government panels, which we'll talk to a bit further on as well. So yeah, New Zealand government procurement, this whole slide kind of explains what we do. We look after all of government contracts for a whole lot of common goods and services, everything from people's fleet and vehicles through to legal services, media services, and there's also another government department here in New Zealand that look after a lot of the IT projects, which is part of Department of Internal Affairs. We provide advice and expertise for agencies on how to go about their procurements and what sort of approach to take. And like I said, we also have these all government contracts which cover a whole lot of different services that suppliers can sign up for, and we open up those all government panels at certain time spans. Some of them are every 3 or 4 years, some are a bit longer than that. And it means that suppliers are then able to apply to be on the panels, and they can gain work through those panels with government agencies. That's also managed through, we've got a system called GETS that we'll talk about a bit further too, further on.
Yeah, thanks, Charlotte. So the New Zealand Government Procurement Branch, which is where Charlotte and I work, with a system leader for procurement, and so most of the procurement decisions are made independently inside the government agencies, and our role is more sort of guidance, oversight, and providing the framework for agencies to be able to achieve their own policy objectives through their procurement activities. So starting about 12 months ago, we began a program called Procurement for the Future, which was to change the way that government agencies do their procurement. The procurement function, as maybe those of you who have worked with government agencies before would be aware, is often perceived as being pretty slow and bureaucratic, not particularly easy to work with. So we've got three main pillars of our strategy about how we're trying to change the way the New Zealand government system does its procurement. Big focus on data and transparency, so making it clear to the public, the taxpayers in New Zealand, but also the suppliers, where the money's being spent and with whom and on what. Working together as one, so the government acting more as one customer, so that it's, again, easier for suppliers to interact with us, and unlocking value, getting some collaboration across government agencies and making sure we're working as effectively and efficiently as we can. It's not a program with a sort of a defined end date. There's a lot of things that will take a really long time to change around how government agencies work together, and some of it requires legislative change and other things over time. So we're talking about a sort of a continuous change from now, or a year or so ago, through to about 2035 is when we ultimately aim to hopefully have a completely refreshed procurement system. But the framework and the system that we operate in, with that devolved accountability and responsibility amongst agencies, is principles based. So we've got the 5 principles, which you can see on the screen here now, that guide how a government agency would do its procurement. And it's essentially about, planning, being fair, open, transparent, getting a good deal, and playing by the rules. So there's a lot to consider when we're spending public money that you don't need to consider quite as carefully if you're spending private sector money. So that's kind of where a lot of this stuff comes from. So we don't have a great big legislative framework for how government agencies do their procurement in New Zealand. We have the principles, and then we have some rules, and agencies some agencies are mandated to follow those rules and follow the principles. And the diagram here shows roughly where the line's drawn. The public service and the state services are essentially our core government agencies. So about 140 agencies are mandated and must follow our rules and must follow the direction we set as the procurement system leader. And then the wider state sector and public sector, so that goes out to things like universities, schools, councils, are encouraged to follow the rules and our guidance. And often they do, because it's just, for the most part, it's largely just common sense and good procurement practice.
So we've also got some guidance and information on understanding the Trans-Tasman procurement policy. So government procurement in New Zealand isn't centralised. Individual agencies are responsible for their own undertaking their own procurement. Here at NZGP, we provide advice and with the all government contracts, what we call the sort of vehicle to work within agencies. However, they still have to have their own decision-making processes and their own policies, procurement policies there. And we also in New Zealand don't have specific procurement legislation. So in places like the UK and things, there is actually specific legislation set up for that. We don't have that here. So we've got the framework, and that's that combination of principles, expectations and rules and guidance that we've talked about, and that principles of transparency and fairness there too. For Australian organisations, there's actually an Australia and New Zealand government procurement agreement, which we've put a link to in this particular slide here. And so that basically means that when Australian companies are engaging with New Zealand, there's that single market for procurement. So it makes it easier for Australian suppliers and stuff to actually interact here without having to worry about what our specific rules and things are.
Have we? Right, jump forward a bit far. Let me go back a bit. Yeah, so we have these rules and the framework that provides the framework that the government agencies work within. Looking for types of public value that government agencies are interested in when they're doing their procurement. Obviously, value for money is a key one for government agencies, particularly with the focus of our new government. The other sort of broader types of public value that we talk about in New Zealand are called broader outcomes, and that's one of our procurement rules. It's a concept that a lot of agencies, to be honest, and a lot of suppliers struggle to understand, but broader outcomes are those other types of public value that can be delivered through a procurement. So in the private sector, it's often referred to as environmental and social governance. It's things of that nature that are incidental to your procurement, but help lift living standards or other environmental objectives, for example, as a consequence of doing your procurement. So the secondary benefits, essentially. They're very similar to the UN, or based off the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which some of you may be familiar with if you've worked in other markets, and support things like our living standards framework in New Zealand. That's a framework that the Treasury uses to assess investments. So the priority areas for broader outcomes at the moment are increasing access for New Zealand businesses. As an Australian business, as Charlotte said earlier, you're not discriminated against as being an Australian business. You are able to access the New Zealand market, but often for opportunities with government agencies, particularly for larger tenders, to meet the broader outcomes requirement, you often need to think about, how do I partner with New Zealand businesses, or do I need to employ some people in New Zealand, and how does that help me help the agency deliver on its broader outcome? There's a specific objective around improving construction sector skills and training. Some of that is also health and safety focused. There's also health and safety broader outcome for forestry, which is off that same three of priorities. There's a big focus on carbon and waste reduction. We have a carbon neutral government program here that is linked to New Zealand's commitments under the Paris Agreement with our 2050 target for carbon reduction. And a big focus on improving conditions for New Zealand workers. So that's, again, health and safety, paying living wage rather than minimum wage, and other things of that nature. So an area to explore with agencies when they're doing a tender, to try and understand exactly what it is they're after there. And just to finish off with the all government contracts, so of that $51 billion that the New Zealand government spends annually, about $3 billion is covered by our all of government contracts that we administer here from New Zealand Government Procurement. There are around 19 contracts, and they do cover the sort of the common goods and services type things. When we start talking about GETS in a couple of slides, GETS is the place where you'll find information about when these things are coming back to market and when the opportunity is to join some of the panels. Most of the panels are closed and open up intermittently to allow new suppliers on. One or two of the panels, the Construction Consultancy Services panel, for example, is open 24/7, and it can just be accessed at any point. That's via the DIA marketplace, which we'll talk about as well. But these contracts are mandatory for those 140 agencies that have to follow our rules. And most other agencies who aren't mandated to use them choose to use them anyway, because they offer a much better deal than a small agency can get. Essentially, they're a means for us to aggregate government demand, get a better deal. So government agencies are usually reasonably keen on them. They do pay an administration fee to us to use them, which they don't like. For suppliers, it is a good opportunity to do one contract, negotiate with one organisation, and get access to a market of at least a couple of hundred agencies who are guaranteed to have to use that contract, and in some cases 1,000 or 1,500 agencies who use them.
So we'll just cover a bit more on opportunities and kind of where to find them. We've got a system that we have that we run through New Zealand Government Procurement is GETS, which is the Government Electronic Tender Service. So if you've done any work in the past with any New Zealand government, you'll see, you may have used this or you may have heard of it. It's free to use. It's designed to promote open and fair competition, and the New Zealand public sector agencies use GETS to advertise their tenders. Some agencies, as Craig mentioned before, are mandated to use GETS for large tenders over $100,000. In terms of actually using GETS, we have got, what you need to get started. So a RealMe account, which is a New Zealand account that was set up probably in the last 10 years that is used for a whole lot of different government departments here. Having a New Zealand business number can be really helpful. You'll need your email address, phone number, all of that kind of thing. We've got the links here to use GETS so that you can jump on and have a look after this session. In terms of how you're using it, you're logging in with RealMe, you're registering as a supplier, you can set up notifications in there, which can be really helpful, and it will let you know when agencies post up not an advertisement, but what their tender for a particular service that they want to buy. And excuse me, you can register for those in the different terms of their IT or construction or what other particular sectors they're in. You can subscribe to tenders there, download those documents, ask questions, and then you can respond through there as well. It is really useful, and we've got quite a lot of information on our NZGP website about how to use GETS as well, which can be really helpful. As I mentioned before, the Department of Internal Affairs here in New Zealand looks after most of the IT contracts. So they've got some common capability contracts which are managed currently outside of this marketplace, but also a whole lot of things, software as a service, ICT security services, web design, and a whole lot of other things that come through the marketplace. So we've got some links in there for that too, but basically you can log in as a supplier, request to join particular panels. The marketplace is open all the time with their catalogues, which is quite helpful. You submit your request with your services, your pricing and all of that kind of thing, and then that's reviewed by the marketplace team. The agencies, once you're on those panels, the agencies can then go in and browse all your catalogues, look at the particular services you offer, look at your pricing, and then run a secondary procurement process through that. So all the primary procurement is done by DIA, and that's the same for us with the GETS process too. In the marketplace, there's a whole lot of channels, catalogues, and services. So you can see on that slide there, it explains how those are all listed. And if you have a look at that website that we've got the link to there, it explains further detail, and it's got information for agencies and suppliers in there on how you log in. You can also look at all the terms and conditions for the marketplace through there as well, which is really helpful.
Yeah, so that's, I guess, the channels that the government agencies use to essentially advertise their opportunities. I guess it may be also good to note that via GETS, government agencies can advertise in a couple of different ways. They can advertise what's called a future procurement opportunity. So it might just be, it's just an advance notification essentially that at some point in the future, generally a month or 3 from now, we're going to come to the market with a tender or with a request for proposals. And then the actual proposal is advertised there as well. And you can sign up and then you get all the notifications for that tender. So you're not going to miss out on anything. So I thought from here, we'll just talk a little bit about the New Zealand, I guess, economic environment, the priorities of the new government, and we've just had our budget process finished off here in New Zealand at the end of May as well. So talk a little bit about some of the budget announcements and what that means for procurement opportunities. So this slide is just a very high level overview of the roughly $51 billion that the government procures annually. Large chunk of that, about 18 billion, is in the infrastructure space, and that's an area that the current government has a big focus on as well, which we'll talk about in a little more detail shortly. The social sector has about $12 billion worth of social services provided here in New Zealand, so that's everything from speech language therapy to housing assistance and all sorts of things of that nature. The property spend at $500 million looks small because that doesn't include the building. That's just services, facilities management, and office accommodation, things of that nature. And ICT, which is another big one, is $8 billion. So from Budget 24, which was announced a couple of weeks ago, a big focus for this government on infrastructure. New Zealand has by some estimates, more than $200 billion infrastructure gap based on sort of deferred maintenance and projects that just haven't been done over several decades now. So this government has a focus on plugging that gap, focusing on infrastructure that's going to help increase New Zealand productivity. So there's a list here. I won't go through them all. We are going to share the slides after the presentation, so you'll be able to have a look. Talk about a couple of them in a bit more detail. There's a regional infrastructure fund which will get allocated to largely regional councils and local councils, things of that nature, to spend in their area on resilience, particularly for flooding, which is a common problem here in New Zealand. Quite a lot on building new schools, and a reasonable spend for New Zealand anyway on defence equipment and infrastructure. So the Regional Infrastructure Fund, $1.2 billion worth of funding announced for the next, I think, 3 years, to be spent on resilience, what's called resilience infrastructure. So you may be aware New Zealand has quite a lot of climate risk. So this is around flood and weather event protection, water supply resilience, shoring up energy and telecommunications infrastructure to make it more climate resilient. And then the other focus is enabling infrastructure. So roading, transmission, innovation facilities, things of that nature that will help the regions in New Zealand, so outside of the big cities, into the more rural communities, to enable more innovation and productivity growth in those areas. So that will get apportioned out in fairly small aliquots, which will present a lot of procurement opportunities at a kind of local level that are probably suitable for small and medium enterprises in a lot of cases. As Charlotte said earlier, the Department for Internal Affairs and Statistics New Zealand are our digital and data system leaders. They have a plan to invest in a digital New Zealand government service, which includes about $13.5 billion worth of spend over the next 5 years on data and investment. So a list of some of the priorities that spend has been tagged for here, and that's via the marketplace and the panel arrangements Charlotte was talking about earlier, but also via specific projects that agencies run as well. One example is the Ministry for Social Development doing a large transformation project to renew all of their digital systems that help them pay New Zealand beneficiaries. So lots of opportunities for sort of big prime contractors in those big projects, but also subcontracting opportunities as well. And about $1.5 billion worth of funding in total announced for the education sector. So that includes a lot of infrastructure, building schools and buildings, but also quite an investment in the digital space as well. Our schools are probably a bit behind the 8 ball in terms of their digital infrastructure. So they're looking for things particularly around cybersecurity and digital services for both students and teachers.
Right, so some final tips that we've got here, and obviously we're here to answer any questions that you've got as well. In terms of when you're applying through GETS or for particular tenders and things with any government agencies, is we've got this always answer the exam question in the tender. So one of the things we've found running tenders and things in the past is when a supplier might miss out on a particular area, quite often the feedback we'll get from agencies is that they didn't answer the question the way that they wanted it answered. So more detail rather than less, I think, is always really helpful. Make sure you ask any questions, especially if the information in those tender documents doesn't quite make sense to you or you need them to elaborate. Agencies are able to answer questions. They've just got to make sure that they share that information with all suppliers so that everyone's on an even keel. If you are unsuccessful in a tender, make sure that you take up the opportunity for a debrief. If the agency doesn't offer one, do ask for one, because there can be really helpful information in those debriefs. It's an opportunity to ask any questions you've got. Also, the agency will be able to give you a bit more detail around where you missed out and what they need. And quite often, like I said, it comes back to they wanted more detail, more case studies and things like that. I think a really important one is making sure that you research the agency and their policy objectives, and making sure, like you would with any customer when you are looking to sell something, is making sure that you actually, the response you give to the tender is actually going to meet their needs, and that you have an understanding of what they're trying to do in their environment. I think that's most of our tips.
Yeah, that's the end of our presentation and our tips. Certainly happy to take questions from there.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Craig and Charlotte. That was really informative. If you do have any questions, I'd encourage you just to drop them into the Q&A section there. Can I just kick off with one thing, though? And I know many of our members are frustrated on this side of the Tasman at closed procurement panels that never have an opportunity to be reconsidered. You mentioned that things are sort of open intermittently, but is there a rolling schedule of panel refreshes that applies in New Zealand?
Yes, there is. And suppliers in New Zealand have, I think, similar frustrations to the ones that our Australian counterparts would probably express. A lot of the panels have been closed for a long time and don't open up as frequently as suppliers would like, and it's not helpful for competition or agencies in all regards as well. So the all of government panel agreements have their expiry dates and when they're being opened up on our website, and there's a link in the presentation to that. It is something as part of our Procurement for the Future work plan. We're thinking about how do we make the panels more, or panel arrangements in general, more accessible, open them more frequently. Part of that is the tools that we use to add suppliers to the agreement. So one of our projects that will help that is a new procurement platform that we're building that will make joining and accessing the panels a whole lot easier.
Thank you. And when panels are open, obviously you've got a timeline for them, but are they on Gets as well?
Yeah, so those are all advertised on Gets. There'll be a future procurement opportunity followed by the actual tender a month or so later, and you can. So on Gets, you can follow either the UNSPC code, which is the unique code for maybe a subject area that you're interested in, or you can follow a specific agency as well and get all of their notifications. So you can kind of pick and choose which things you want to be notified about.
Is there any extra weight that's kind of added when you're considering tender responses to Australian businesses that it might be partnering with Kiwi firms, or can they literally stand on their own as they sort of put an application in?
I mean, they can stand on their own, and it is up to each individual agency when they run their tender what it is they ask for. So that's, we give the guidance and we ask people to consider broader outcomes and these other things, but each agency gets to decide how they do that. So it will be a little bit different from tender to tender. If they've got a broader outcomes objective to develop New Zealand businesses, then Australian businesses will need to consider, how they might do that, either through partnering with a New Zealand business or possibly having some staff in New Zealand or hiring local workers. The other part that's the other aspect of that, which is probably more difficult for Australian businesses to understand, is how does working with iwi Māori groups fit into your broader outcomes objectives as well. So that's part of that New Zealand business development angle as well, understanding the any sort of local Māori group interest in the service or goods that you're providing as well.
And a question that has come in is that if a buyer is selecting a vendor from the catalogue, I think the question is actually asking if an agency is going to market and has selected, perhaps because the contract is under the 100K mark, and has simply selected some providers and sought some quotes from them, is a vendor able to contact the agency and say, well, look, I think I could add some real value here, and I'd love to be invited to add a tender in?
I guess there's maybe a couple of ways that could happen. If there's already an established panel and they're doing what we call a secondary procurement from that panel, you could approach the agency that runs the panel and say, hey, how do we get on your panel? Maybe the answer might be, well, not for a year or two, in which case you can kind of, lodge a complaint with them, which may not do you any good at that point, but does help kind of build the case that, this panel needs to come back to market and get refreshed. The other way is if it's a secondary procurement or it's a primary procurement that's not off a panel, there's nothing to stop you reaching out to an agency and saying, hey, I think maybe I should have been included in your process. Depending on where they're at, they may or may not be able to do anything. If ultimately, you're entirely unsatisfied with how that's gone, then you can lodge a complaint with that agency. Then if they don't, a formal complaint with them, and if they don't sort of resolve that to your satisfaction, there is a process to raise a complaint with us at New Zealand Government Procurement as system leader for procurement to see whether to ensure that the rules and best practices have been followed.
I think the concern for many businesses I talk to is not so much how do you complain about a process that's gone wrong, but how do you actually just put yourself in the frame to be considered.
And I guess there's we've got a general email address that is on the bottom of this presentation. We are happy to hear, maybe not quite the right phrase, but we are keen to hear from suppliers about their general experience engaging with government agencies as well. That does give us good feedback for us to think about how do we work with the system to provide better opportunities for suppliers.
And we are also working on some more guidance and things at the moment for both agencies and suppliers on our website. But my team started working on things that were aimed at agencies and sort of realised along the way that there's actually a bit of a gap with suppliers too. So in our larger branch, there's a few teams that we're all working with together to make sure that there's actually some, because for people who haven't been involved in the procurement process, or particularly with agencies directly before, it can be quite hard to understand how to navigate that. So we want to sort of watch this space, because we want to make sure that the website does have some easy to understand guidance in there too.
Thank you. One further question is that I noticed on one of those slides there was, I think 408 million has been allocated for work in the defence space. Now there's lots of defence businesses who may be watching this. Are there any particular security clearance requirements that Australian firms may need to be considering when they're looking at defence contracting?
Yes, but nothing that an Australian firm wouldn't be able to meet, I don't believe, as long, there are not a lot of defence contractors in New Zealand, so the majority of our work is done by overseas firms.
All right. I'll just offer a final call for any questions that anyone might have. Otherwise, if there's nothing else coming in, we might call it a day at that. Charlotte and Craig, I'd like to thank you very much for your time this afternoon. It's been really informative. And sorry, there is just one more question that snuck in at the end there. So in Australia, if you can provide a particular service and are not invited, you can ask the buyer agency to invite you, and a number of agencies will oblige, but others use all sorts of excuses, ranging from our procurement plan has been signed off, or that it will compromise the procurement process, even though value for money will be demonstrated. But it sounds like from what you were saying earlier that there is always an opportunity to to at least raise your hand and say, I'd like to be considered.
Certainly raise your hand, but I think depending on the agency and where they're at in the process, you could well get similar answers that, our plan's set or we're beyond the point where we can add anybody. So I would say it's probably a reasonably similar experience between New Zealand and Australia.
All right. Well, thank you very much. That was really, really useful, I think. Thank you very much, Craig Butler and Charlotte Pottinger from the Ministry for Business, Innovation and Employment in New Zealand. Thank you to Business Central for helping us pull this together, and of course to the ACT government. Thank you very much.
Thank you.